Hello everybody. I wanted to give you a little bit more information about movement of groundwater and groundwater systems in hopes that it will help you with quiz. So when rain falls, it takes several paths. We've already talked about evaporation, of course, but it can also run off and it will soak into the ground or infiltrate into the ground. This is the component of water that we refer to as groundwater. Some water will stay in the soil, and that is soil moisture. It's held there by the molecular attraction between water and the soil particles, and this is the water that's used by plants. If you ever plant anything in the garden, this is what you'll be digging in. You're digging into that unsaturated zone. So what's there? There's oxygen there, there's soil particles there, and there's soil moisture there. Water not held as soil moisture will percolate downward until it reaches what we call the zone of saturation. These are can be unconsolidated material like sand and gravel, or it can be rock. Pore spaces between the sand and gravel or the pore spaces between the particles that make up the rock are filled with water. Now this is molecular water. It's not like there's a river that's running through the rocks. That can happen in special cases, but normally that's not the case. The water is held in the pore spaces of the rocks. So you know how tiny those pore spaces can be. But it's saturated. The rock formation is saturated, so we call that the zone of saturation. And the top of that is called the water table. And the water table can move up and down depending on the weather. When it's really, really dry, the water table will drop. We know all about that here in California. When we get a particularly rainy time, the water table will rise. So the flow of groundwater and the amount of water that can be stored in rock will depend on two things: porosity and permeability. These two words right here. Let me get another color pen. These two terms right here, porosity. Porosity is the amount of void space in a rock. I'll show you another view of this in a second. I'll put my crappy drawing up here though. So remember, these are tiny spaces, teeny tiny spaces, but these are teeny tiny particles that I'm drawing here. So there are teeny tiny spaces between these teeny tiny particles, and those teeny tiny spaces are filled with water. Those teeny tiny spaces are called pores. So the number of pores will determine the porosity of the rock. But the other term that we need to be aware of, and that's all important when we're talking about the distribution of water in the ground, is permeability. Permeability is the interconnectedness of those pore spaces. Porous means that the rock will hold water. Permeability means that the water can be transmitted. It really doesn't do any good if we have a rock that's just holding water, because if we drop a well down into it, then we'll suck that water out and it'll be empty. If we want that well to continue to be a functioning well, there has to be permeability between these particles. The water has to be capable of being transmitted, moving. So those pores have to be interconnected. That gives us permeability. And a good aquifer has to be both porous and permeable. There is a name for, actually, that we're not supposed to say aquitard, it's aquiclude. Those are impermeable layers that will prevent the movement of water. So if you're going to drill a well, you're not going to drill your well into an aquiclude, because it won't be a functioning well if that's the case. So this is what we're talking about by these pore spaces. Again, this is magnified so that you can actually visualize this stuff. But these are the pore spaces. So this is a rock that would just be porous. Notice how these pores aren't interconnected. If you've looked at or done the quiz on let me erase that. That's not what I want to do here. On rocks, you know that there's a particular type of rock called vesicular basalt. Those vesicles are the pores. So vesicular basalt would be a porous rock, but it's not permeable. Unless there are cracks and fractures in that basalt, that water is just going to be held into the pores. So we want permeability. We want that water to be capable of moving and being transmitted through all of these pore spaces. So again, just to emphasize, a good aquifer has to be both porous and permeable. What we have illustrated here is a portion of the groundwater system. We have the zone of aeration, or the unsaturated zone, and we have the zone of saturation, or what we would call a water table aquifer, or an unconfined aquifer. This is the zone of aeration, or the unsaturated zone, or I like to call this the plant root zone. If we're planting something, this is where we would be planting our flowers or our vegetables. And this is where we have soil moisture that is in here, but it's not, the pore spaces are not completely saturated. We have oxygen in here, we have soil particles. So if we were to drill a well into this zone of aeration, or unsaturated zone, it's not going to be a successful well. But at some point, as over the eons, as rain has been collecting and infiltrating into the ground, we're going to get to a portion of the groundwater system where all the pore spaces are filled with water. And the top of that, what we call the zone of saturation, is called the water table. And the water table will go up and down with the weather, as I said before. If we get a lot of rain, the water table will rise. If we're in a drought, the water table will drop. So if we were to put a well in here, we would want to put it deep enough so that in a dry time, when the water table drops, the well would still be able to furnish water to us. Now, that's not all the time possible. During our severe drought here in California, you had many, many farmers and ranchers and cities and towns that were drilling deeper wells because the wells were dropping below the water table. So this went up, down in response to weather. Then, in some cases, we can have, within this zone of aeration, we can have what's called a hard pan. That's something else that's familiar to us here in California because of all the clay that we have in the soil. We can have a hard pan that builds up, and that hard pan is rock-like. It's clay that's baked to like a brick hard surface. So in that particular case, as water infiltrates into this area, it's not going to be able to make it through, because that would be called, aquitard is kind of the old word, aquiclude. It precludes the movement of water, so that water would be sitting on top. All the pore spaces would be filled with this water, and if we were to drop a well in here, then that would be a successful well. Not sure how long it might last, but depends on how large what the extent of the aquiclude is and how much water has accumulated. But you see here, this water that's coming out of the hillside, that's happening as a result of that water table intersecting with the hillside. So we would have springs that form. I love springs. They're kind of magic things where water just appears out of nowhere. The well would be dropped in, and it would be successful for a time, maybe forever, depending on how much water is being taken out of it. Okay, so water table well, zone of saturation. We can also call this area here, let me make sure that I have my pen in the right place, an unconfined aquifer. Unconfined because it goes up and down. The water table goes up and down, as I stated before. Okay, and here The stream that's running down the middle of these two hillsides, that stream is there as a result of that water table again intersecting the surface right here. The unconfined aquifer is high enough so that it reaches the surface and we have a stream flowing. Anytime we see a stream flowing and it isn't raining, that's the water table. And you can understand what would happen to this stream during a drought time. That water table would drop. There would be a trickle, if that, in the stream. All right, so here is another view of a groundwater system, and we've added something to it here. We've got some folds in here. We've got some faults in here, and we have a recharge area. Recharge area is like an area in the mountains where rain falls and these rocks are exposed, and over the thousands and thousands of years that rain recharges or charges aquifers. So this is just showing you how we get oases or springs in deserts. Here's an aquifer, here's an aquiclude right here, and we always show aquicludes with these dashed lines that represent shale. Remember, shale is composed of clay particles, and clay particles are the teeniest of the tiny sediment sizes. Boulders, cobbles, boulders, cobbles, pebbles, sand, silt, clay. So clay is the tiniest. So the pore spaces between these individual particles are going to be teeny tiny also. So that's why it's an aquiclude. And here's a nice aquifer, and you see what happened. Here's this aquifer that has reached the surface, and in the desert we would have an oasis. Anywhere else we would call that a spring. And then a fault line is also another good place for water to move. So if it's faulted, then we can also get the aquifer, water from the aquifer reaching the surface. And there's what an oasis really looks like in the desert. Anytime you see palm trees in the desert, you know there has. What you're looking at here is a generalized groundwater system. So we're going to go deeper than we were in the previous slide, where we were up here with the unconfined aquifer, the zone of saturation, the unsaturated zone. We're going to go deeper, and we're going to encounter, let's go down here, we're going to encounter an aquiclude. That's what this is, the dashed lines representing shale. And then we're going to have a layer underneath the shale, and it's going to be sandstone, and that's going to be an aquifer. Then underneath that, we have another aquiclude. So this aquifer right here that's squeezed in between the two is called a confined aquifer. And if the recharge area here in the mountains, if the recharge area is high enough, then this aquifer is going to be, the water is going to be under pressure, and it has the potential to flow out higher than the water table down here without a pump. To get water out of the ground when we put a well into an unconfined aquifer, we have to have a pump to get it out. But this, if all the conditions are right, and they hardly ever are anymore because so many people have wells poked into aquifers, but it has the potential to flow out on its own, and that is called an artesian well, flowing artesian well. This one here, if we go to this inset right here, this one is a non-flowing artesian well. Now I don't want to get hung up on a flowing or non-flowing artesian well, but the difference is that the water level is above the top of the aquifer, but it's still not flowing out onto the surface. So in order to, if this was your well and you wanted to get water into your house, you would still have to put a pump in here. But for the flowing artesian wells, that water flows out on the surface. So we have artesian springs, we have artesian wells. And then here's our recharge area. The question always arises, okay, if water can't percolate through these aquicludes, how does it ever get to recharge any aquifer below? Well, there are leaky aquicludes. Over time, water will eventually seep very slowly into the aquifers, but the major way that the water gets into the aquifer is because that rock is exposed somewhere at the surface. So when it rains, when it snows, that's a recharge area. This would be an analogous situation to the Rocky Mountains and the Great Plains out here. There are stories about when the settlers first came to the Great Plains and they started drilling wells, the water would gush hundreds of feet into the air, and it would stay that way for weeks at a time until the pressure equalized. That doesn't happen anymore because there are so many wells that are drilled into the aquifers here. But non-flowing artesian well over here, there's the pressure surface, and then a flowing artesian well here. Here's the pressure surface, and it's above the ground, so the water will flow out above the ground. Okay, so this is my very horrible groundwater system. So if we put a well in here, this is going to be a water table well, and again, we'd have to have a pump to get it pumped out. This is our aquiclude. This is an aquifer. So if we put a well in here, that has the potential, water has the potential to flow out up to the pressure surface. So that would be an artesian well. Here we have to have a pump. Here in certain circumstances, no pump. Nowadays, it's a pretty good bet that you're going to have a pump to pump it out. And up here, remember, this is our unsaturated zone, or our zone of aeration, our plant root zone. And this is a unconfined aquifer here. Here. And this one is our confined aquifer. And up here in these horrible mountains that I have redrawn, that I've drawn, this is a recharge area. Okay. All right, let's take a closer look then at what happens when we have the ground surface. You know what? Let me erase that. This is going to be our water table, or our unconfined aquifer. So we drop a well in here. Let me not make the well blue. Let's drop a well in here. And again, the water table is going to be right here at the top of the unconfined aquifer. So we call that water level that is there before we pump the static water level. Okay, so we have to put a pump in to get the water up here into our shack. When that happens, when we turn the pump on, what happens is it creates a area of lower pressure, higher pressure, lower pressure in the pump, and water is going to move from high pressure to low pressure, so that water level drops, and that's called the pumping water level. The difference between the static water level and the pumping water level is called the drawdown of the well. Now you can understand what's going to happen. What if you have another well in here? Maybe it's a neighborhood, you have more houses in here. Everybody's got their straws poked into the confined aquifer. You can understand what is going to happen to that pumping water level. That pumping water level might drop down below the bottom of the well, and if that happens, then the well is dry, and you're going to have to drill another well, drill this one deeper. So those are considerations that have to be taken into account. How many people are pumping water out of a particular aquifer? How much water? Maybe you have plenty of water for 2 people, but maybe you're having guests. So people are taking showers, somebody has loaded up the washer to wash clothes, somebody's trying to wash dishes. Everybody's pulling water out, and that water level will drop down. So the well then will suck air. So you have to quit all the activities until the well recharges itself. So if we looked at that drawdown, the 3-dimensional look to it would be, let's say here's our well. Well, that drawdown would look like this all around the well, and that is called the cone of depression. You can make a cone of depression if you stick a straw in a soft drink and you start sucking on it. If you look at the bottom of that straw, or the top of the straw, you will see that there's a little cone of depression around it, and that's what the pumping well makes also, a cone of depression. Okay, if you have any questions about that, just shoot me an email. Okay, so springs. Springs happen where the water table intersects the ground surface, causing groundwater to flow out on the surface. Springs, as I said before, I think are these kind of magical areas because you've got free water coming out of the ground. Every place that has spring in the place name, it's because there was a spring there, maybe still is, but there was there at one time. Think of Colorado Springs, Hot Springs, Palm Springs, Soda Springs, Saratoga Springs. And sometimes there are hot springs, sometimes there are warm springs. Geysers happen when water is ejected outward forcefully. The water erupts, and it's because the water goes into the ground, it gets heated up, it gets under pressure, and it blasts out of the ground. And the water is able to circulate to a great depth where it's heated up. So this is one of the famous hot springs of the world. This is a Roman baths in Bath, England. I bet you don't know how it got its name. And this is where the Romans had these fancy baths, fancy buildings, fancy spas. And you can tour this place and you can look at the spot where that hot water is coming out of the ground. You can see the steam coming off the water. Nobody is able to use these any longer. When I was there, I was told that it's contaminated. That's probably just to keep visitors out of these. There's a geyser. These are hot springs. These are boiling hot springs in Modoc County in California in Surprise Valley. This is a field trip that I had there several years ago. This is one of these hot springs. This rancher actually had this water it was coming out of also out of the side of the mountain here. He had it directed into a little pool that people could get into if they so chose, where it's cooler. This is actually boiling right here. You would not want to get into the boiling water. And then there's an overflow and it goes out and waters all the crops or whatever might be growing, or as a water supply for the cattle. And this is just showing how hot springs form. The water has to be heated, so it's in contact with hot rocks. Remember, Surprise Valley is in the Basin and Range. If you hear that siren, it's nothing to do with me. Basin and Range is being stretched, so the rocks are thin. That means that magma is closer to the surface, so those rocks get heated, and therefore the water is going to be heated, and as the circulation comes up to the surface, we get a hot spring, or in certain cases, if it's under great pressure, we can get a geyser. And here's the fire truck. These are geysers and hot springs in New Zealand. And then, yes, the well is a hole drilled into the zone of saturation to bring groundwater up to the surface. And then we already talked about artesian wells, but here's some pictures of them. This water isn't being pumped. It's coming out to the surface all on its own. Again, here's our aquicludes, here's our aquifer, and here's an artesian well. And here's a water level before pumping begins. And let's turn on the water, and you can see this is a large irrigation well, and you can see how much lower it's pulling way more water out, so that cone of depression drops even lower. And it can drop so that the house, which might have had water before the irrigation pump got turned on, now that cone of depression is below the bottom of the well, so they've got a dry well right now. Will it recover when they turn off the pump? Probably. But who wants to deal with that headache? What you're looking at here is one of the reasons that aquifers are being depleted across the West and the Midwest. This is Centerpivot irrigation. There's a well in the middle, and the water comes out in this metallic contraption right here, which is on wheels, and as it goes around, water is spraying out of it. So a very intensive use of groundwater, and there's more and more and more of this taking place. You don't normally see just dryland farming anymore. It doesn't happen. Everybody does center pivot irrigation now. So more and more groundwater is being used. If you think about the thousands and thousands of wells that are in the Ogallala Aquifer, it's no wonder that an aquifer that took tens of thousands of years to charge, in less than 200 years, it's going to be out of water, or so depleted that there are going to be people that are having to look for other ways to get water. These systems cost an awful lot of money, and that's one of the reasons that folks can't go to something like drip irrigation, because the investment has been too dear. Okay, I'm going to stop there, and I hope to see you next time.